Hi, I'm Daniel Fisher here at Sweetwater Sound, and today's Synth Clips video is about LFOs. It's about the various shapes that we have, whether they're unipolar or bipolar, and how we use them when assigned to pitch or filter or panning or amplitude or various other things. And so I'm going to start with a Roland Juno-DS as an example of a rompler. And one of the most obvious uses for LFOs is vibrato. And I can set it all up with the mod wheel. I'm not actually going to do that right now. I just want to go direct from the LFO to pitch, just to kind of show you very exact examples. And I have an init patch, which just has a very plain piano with nothing set up to make it sound like a piano. It's just straight on, straight off. But I'm going to go in and edit, and I am at LFO 1, and my wave shape right now is at triangle. So it starts at 0, it goes up, it comes back to 0, it goes below 0, comes back up. And it is what we call a bipolar wave, in that it is going both above 0 and below 0 as a control. So when I add it to my pitch, by going to LFO to pitch depth, as I increase it, it's going to spread the pitch both upward and downward, right? So here we go, here's none. Okay, there's subtle, all the way to crazy. And always explore the full depth of LFO to anything just to hear what it might do. Sometimes you can find some fantastic accidents that way. All right, so that makes sense. And I'm going to show you what it might sound like if I had a unipolar wave. In other words, a wave that instead of going above and below 0, starts at 0 and only goes above 0. And Roland doesn't do it that way. They actually do it a different way. They have this thing called offset, which simply takes the whole wave and can adjust it above and below 0. But I'm going to just throw the wheel 100% and create basically a unipolar wave that's only going positive. And when you hear the vibrato on this, you're going to hear it go out of key because, so here's no LFO to pitch. Here's some more, and it's only going upward. It no longer sounds like the same pitch. Here's my original pitch. Conversely, if I did a unipolar below 0, it's going to sound flat, right? And so you're probably thinking, why on earth do you want a unipolar wave, especially if you're going to pitch, when almost always you want it to be going above and below the pitch, the standard pitch. And one really good example of why you'd want it is square waves. So I'm going to go up and change my waveform from triangle to square. And now I have two very distinct pitches because it's doing just those two values. And if I turn my pitch depth back to 0, you're going to hear, instead of a rather musical motion above and below the pitch, which still makes you hear that pitch, because we're now at two distinct levels, you're going to hear non-standard tunings spreading apart that typically is not very musical. And it's very hard to get a top note that you like and a bottom note that you like, because music very rarely moves exactly evenly in both directions like that for pitch. So by setting my offset 100% positive, or on other synth having a unipolar wave, which is typically from 0 to 100% positive, now when I'm at 0, I hear my original pitch. And as I add depth, it's going to alternate between that pitch and this other pitch that I picked. So now I can very precisely pick the musical intervals. So now I kind of have a major second trill. and that has its musical uses. And notice that this LFO is working globally on all of them at the same time. It doesn't have to be that way, but that is how it is right now. And it is not restarting every time. So that is another consideration. But listen as I go from that to now I'm going to go to a perfect fifth. Okay, now I'm alternating between the original pitch and a fifth up. And again, that has musical implications. However, you probably noticed that it's kind of annoying that you never know where it's going to be in that square wave when I hit a key. Well, most synths allow you to have this thing. In this particular case, it's called Key Trigger, and it always makes the LFO start in the same spot. Here how it's every time, right? And you say, oh yeah, but it's always starting on the high note. I really wish it would start on the other note. That's when changing the offset to the opposite direction comes in handy. So here we go. So now I'm always hearing the high note and then the low note. But because it's on key trigger, now each key has its own start time. So if I roll it, you hear that rolling stay with all of them. Very, very different from now. No matter how I roll it, they're all the same. And now if I roll it, okay, and now we'll pick a different wave shape. We'll use, instead of square wave, we're going to use Sawtooth up. Kind of an alarm. Sawtooth down. Use that for weapons. And again, by changing the offset, I can determine where I'm starting in the wave. So now it's always down. I always start going down first. And some synthesizers allow you to choose exactly where in the phase you start. So you can start exactly at a certain spot at that LFO, and it will always start from there if you have key trigger on. So it's almost like having a little tiny envelope, especially with Sawtooth waves, where you can kind of have a little envelope shape that starts whenever you want and however you want within that Sawtooth. So a lot of power there. So now let's switch to a different synth. Okay, so now I have the ASM Hydrasynth set up, and it's a particularly good synth to demonstrate the LFO because it has all of the LFO buttons right out here in front. In fact, you have all your envelopes here, all your LFOs here, and everything in the middle is the audio path. So control paths are on the outside, audio paths down the middle. And I'm going to use LFO1 to do vibrato first. And in order to assign it, I'm going to use the Mod Matrix. Now, to be clear, there is a dedicated vibrato. I've already disabled it just so we can build one to show it to you, but there is one built in. I took that out. So I'm going to the Mod Matrix, and that basically lets you connect any controller to any destination. And the way that you do it is you press the assign button and you decide, what am I going to be sending? And it's LFO1, so I just touch that. And then I come down a page and it's the destination. What am I going to go to? I'm going to go to Oscillator 1. And then the next page down is, well, what am I going to send it to in Oscillator 1? And that, in this case, is the pitch. And then the very last parameter is how much of the LFO is going to pitch. So I go back to the LFO page. I'll set it to triangle. And then if I go to my Mod Matrix, I can go from no vibrato to I can set the speed of that. That was actually a little slow. I typically start right around 5 to 6 hertz, just because it's sort of a vocal vibrato. But obviously your needs will vary. And so I go back to my LFO, and I'll set that depth again that I want. And the LFOs can have fade-in times, and fade-in times are really useful. It basically just means that every time you press a key, the LFO doesn't start right away, but it climbs in slowly at a certain rate. So, and it's in milliseconds. But if I set it to 1 second, it's going to take a while to get there. Starts gentle. And if I don't want any vibrato at all at the beginning, then I have this thing called delay, and I can actually have 0 vibrato for the length of time of this. So I'm going to go a half a second with no vibrato at all, and then fade in over a second. So here it is. And that can be very musical, even though I have no, I'm just using a plain Sawtooth with no envelopes or filters or anything. But just watch how, with no hands, I can get a vibrato to come in roughly how I want it to. So I can just, so there's no vibrato, and all I gotta do is stop. And there's my vibrato. So that's the delay time for your LFO, your fade-in time for your LFO. And then, like when I showed you on the other ones, we can have different wave shapes. So that was triangle. Now I'm going to use a square instead of a triangle. And it won't sound quite right musically because, like I said, very rarely does going up a certain amount in music sound good going down that exact same amount in music. So what we're going to do is make the square wave unipolar, and the way I do that is I go over to my Mod Matrix, and where it said LFO1, I just keep scrolling until it gets to LFO1 plus. And what that does is it takes that LFO wave and moves it only into the positive. Now if I wanted it moved only into the negative, instead of assigning a positive number as depth, I can just assign a negative number, and that will flip the wave upside down. But now this is what it sounds like when it's in positive. And if I want them all to be in the same time, I can go back to my LFO, and instead of having my sync be poly, I can have my sync be single. And now all the LFOs are going to move at the same time. And so I can actually create little musical interludes happening because of that, and the intervals are all jumping together. And I can also play, like I mentioned before, I can play with the phase. So here, it's starting at the high point, right? What if I want it to start at the low point? Well, I just adjust this until I get to 180 degrees, and now I'll be starting at the low point. And there it is, 180, and now it goes from the bottom to the top. Which makes more sense to me musically. I want to hear the note that I hit when I first hit it. But again, this is what it sounds like at 0. And here's what it sounds like at 180. And it's starting right when I hit the key because I got it on single, and all the keys will be the same. So that's a very useful thing. And all of these kind of tricks sound so much better with effects and everything, but I just want you to hear them raw in their natural state. But just trust me, throw some delay on that. That is either the same delay time as the speed of the LFOs, or some subset or multiple of them, and you'll get all these beautiful little sprinkly things bouncing around in the stereo field. So some very cool stuff there. Now let's do it to something else. So instead of assigning it to pitch, I go back to my Mod Matrix, and I come down here, and instead of oscillator 1, I'm going to assign it to filter one, and it's cutoff. And if I bring the filter cutoff down, you can hear it. Instead of getting low pitch to high pitch, it goes from dark to bright. And if I experiment with different shapes, I can get some pretty cool things. And I'm going to slow it down a little bit too. And now I'll do sine wave. Triangle. Saw up. Saw down. Saw down's a really good one because it creates a very powerful rhythmic effect. And depending on how you sync the LFOs, whether they always start when you press or if they're synced to clock. So you could have arpeggiations going and then little trills that are exactly in time with the arpeggiation, and then have your delay also locked to clock. And so now these arpeggiations are sprinkling through delays and doing all sorts of beautiful things. So it's a very powerful thing. And it really, anything I assign it to, it's going to do similar things. So I'm going to go from saw wave back to triangle wave, and instead of assigning it to filter, I'm going to assign it to amp, right? So now I'm going to have a volume amount change. I'm going to open the filter up. You'll notice it never gets quiet. That's because I'm in unipolar positive, and I'm going to go back to bipolar for LFO1 without the plus, and now it will get as quiet as it gets loud. And I don't have to be as dramatic. Now, I know that I have a tremolo in the effects and I could do it that way, but it's a much more controllable tremolo because I can decide per key whether each has its own oscillator, LFO start at a different time. I can play different games with how much depth goes to each one and stuff like that. But this is just a quick look at different LFO shapes, how you can assign them to different things like filter and pitch and amplitude, and where it's right to use either a bipolar where it's above and below zero, or where it might be more right to use above zero. And as always, try not to turn the depth too much so that it pins. As soon as you stop hearing that perfect shape, you know you've turned the depth up too much. So if you get all those things right, you can get really beautiful LFO effects on everything. So once again, thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions about the ASM Hydrasynth or the Juno-DS by Roland, contact your Sweetwater sales engineer or visit sweetwater.com. My name is Daniel Fisher. Thank you very much for watching.